Hey guys, and welcome to the last video of the series. So this video is just going to be a very quick recap on everything in this scene, basically. So if you was to skip this whole tutorial series, this is the most important stuff. So nothing technical, just the steps. So we've got our scene. This is the render that we got from the end of the last session. So this is our current groom. This is 4 hours, I believe, of video to get to this. So hopefully you guys found that informative. I'm going to close that. And let's walk through our scene. So I'm going to hide the XGen groom. So we start off with a model, which is currently locked. So we start off with a model that it's kind of generally decent topology. This is a ZRemesh, but it's simple enough for this model for it to work. But you want generally topology that is kind of dense enough so that when you hit smooth, the shape doesn't change. So you can see like the chin changes a little bit, but the bits where the hair is doesn't really change at all. The reason you want that is because XGen operates on a smooth version of your mesh. Got that eventually. So be aware of the density. You then want to make sure your UVs are correct. So in the case of this guy, we're not grooming on this mesh. So that's where we can switch to scalp meshes. To create a scalp mesh, all we did was duplicate the head mesh, which is why the topology lines up if you check them. Duplicate the head mesh, delete everything that you don't need, leave a little bit more space than you need. So I'm going to show the guide for a second. So you can see how we've got a little bit more space than we need, and that's because it's easy to remove density, but it's impossible to add it past your scalp mesh. So create your scalp mesh, name it, and make sure that the name is clean, make sure that the grouping of everything is clean. You want to make sure that in general your model is facing Z forward. So if I grab this guy and go into the move tool, you see how the blue arrow is facing forward. That's ideal. And you also want it to be, if possible, in kind of the center of the world. And that's just because that means that the default mirroring tool in XGen, which mirrors across the X, will work on its own. You don't have to do any special treatment for it. And again, this is generally modeled to a real world scale. So his head, I believe, is 10 centimeters across or 15 centimeters across. Whatever the real world measurement is what he's set to. Once you've got your scalp mesh in place, you freeze the transformations, you make the mesh as clean as you can, delete history, and make sure there's no duplicate like shape nodes in your node graph, and just really make sure the mesh is clean as much as possible. You then create some UVs. So UVs, XGen doesn't care that much how your UVs are laid out, but the Maya paint tool really cares about your UVs in that you can't use UDIMs at all. So UV your mesh with as few cuts as possible, and that's just because the Maya paint tool can't smooth across UV borders. So you want to make sure there's no UV borders in any areas that you want to smooth your painting. I generally like to make my UVs pretty symmetrical, and there's no specific technical reason for that. I just generally prefer to. I find it kind of behaves a little bit nicer, like if I'm using symmetry painting, even though the symmetry is in kind of the world space. If the UVs are symmetrical too, you're going to get identical results. Whereas if the UVs are bigger on one side than the other, you might get different resolution. It looks a bit weird. So clean UVs with as few cuts as possible. With a scalp, you shouldn't even need any cuts, to be honest. You just UV the whole thing and unfold it, then just straighten it up. Once you've done that, you go into your XGen window, which in my case is obviously full, but you create a description with your mesh selected. And depending on what you want to do, the general settings are that you use placing and shaping guides randomly across surface with splines. You create a description or a collection, and you can either create it, name it after the character, the shot, whatever you want to name it after. I generally like to name it after the character it's on. In this case, we've already got a collection in our scene, so I can just select the pre-existing collection. And then the description you want to name as cleanly as possible. You want to call it what it is. So if it's fur, then put the word fur. If it's feathers, put the word feather or FTHR or something like that. Give like the beginning of your name just to tell you as much as possible about it. So mine is fur head because it's the hair for the head. The O1 is just a version number, so it's easy for me to duplicate this later and have a backup. And then description is just to say, look, this is a description, which just makes the outline, I feel, a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to read. So once you've created that, you have a groom, which will currently do nothing because you've got no guides. So you go in, you start creating your guides. Rewatch the videos if you want to know how to do any of this. But here's the key things to look for. You want to make sure that your guides are uniformly spaced, i.e. there's no huge gaps. So you see how these are not placed in squares. Squares is not important, but they are placed pretty much everywhere that the hair is. They go right up to the hairline. The hairline does not go past the guides, so you have full control. The guides should also have clean layering, so the hairs kind of sit gently on top of each other. There's no guides that are kind of, curling right in through all the other hairs. And again, depending on hairstyle, that may actually be what you need, but in a vast majority of cases, that is not what you need. The length is also pretty consistent, and we have interesting flows. So an important note to make is that your guides should make the groom look interesting pretty much on their own. So just be aware that if you try to rush through guides and get into modify work, because modify work is the most fun, I'm not going to lie about that, it's very fun, you're going to end up with a groom that looks very amateurish. If you spend time on your guides, you can get a groom that looks interesting on its own. So if I just turn off all the modifiers, all the way down to clumping, turn that off too, we can see that if I hide the guides, this is already, like, as a groom, this works. Like, it's obviously not very realistic because there's no modifiers in it, but the general layering and the flows are all there. You don't have to worry about kind of how it's going to break up later. Like, you're primarily just getting the forms and the flows, and the breakup is handled as a separate step. But you can see how we've got like these swirly patterns. It just looks interesting. If we had guides that were very straight, it doesn't matter how good our modifiers are, our hair will be very straight, it'll be very boring. Even if you use noise in your clumps to compensate for it, it's still not going to feel the same as actually controlling your groom. Once you've got your guides in place, you then go into doing, well, it's up to you really. You can do your mask for the hair, get your general density. The density of this character is 70,000 hairs. You can find that out by going into your log, statistics level set to 1. And when you generate your hair, just open up the log and it will say how long it took, a full render. It took 0.1 second to generate 85,390 primitives. That is the number of hairs. So he's got 85,000 hairs, which is pretty much in the middle of what you expect for the average man. Obviously, that varies a lot depending on age, race, gender, whatever. There's a lot of kind of variety. But this is a good number to aim for. Anywhere from 80,000 to 120,000 sits pretty naturally. Width, if you've modeled to real scale, 0.01 is a good starting point, and then just go up and down from there if you need to. You add taper, which is 0.8 and 0.8 normally. I just reduce my taper slightly. And you get your mask just to define where the hair goes. This mask only tells you where the hair goes. You can add a density map later. I'm not going to explain that for the recap. You can go back to the previous video for that. Then we get into modifiers. So you can create your clumping. It's important that your clumping is done after your region map, which again is just down here. This just defines, which side or which guides you want hairs to follow. If they're all in the same region, then every hair will consider every guide. Whereas if you've got a region map where one side is blue and one side is red, the hairs that are in the blue side will only listen to guides on that same side. So that allows you to create partings without needing hundreds of guides. And then you create another map or a mask just to turn that off towards the back, because otherwise you end up with a parting that doesn't know where to end. Once you've got that in place, just create your clumping. Just going to set up maps. If you've already created your region map, this will be filled out for you, which is a very helpful kind of little feature. You just set your density to be the amount of hairs that you want or the amount of clumps that you want. A smaller number means bigger clumps. That is important. And the mask you can use either as a density map, you can plug a map into this. I personally prefer not to. And if you don't plug a map in and want variation, you can just reduce this number below 1. If you set this to 0.1, it will delete 90% of hairs. And if you set this to 0.9, it will delete 10% of clumps. So you get more or less variation. I find 0.8 down to about 0.6 is a pretty interesting amount. And once you've got your big clumps in place, you paint a mask, and this mask defines where the clumping takes effect. So you see how the clumping is really strong at top, and then it just stops. There are different ways to paint your map, so I've got these random clumps in here. I did cover kind of how I like to achieve that. But ultimately, we paint a map to say where we want the clumps to take effect. We then add our second clumping. So this clumping will normally look very extreme. So if I turn this on, this looks like the greasiest hair you've ever seen, but that is kind of to be expected because there's no noise, there's no cut, there's nothing. But we create this second clumping, and when we create it, we make sure that when we go to set up maps, we make it about 3 or 4 times more dense than the previous layer. And so the previous one was 1.5. I believe when I made this, it was set to a value of 2. So I could lower this and do whatever I want with it. In fact, I'm going to do that just for the sake of showing you what it does. Hit generate. Let's add a little bit of randomness. Let's do 0.8. Generate that again, and just hit save. That'll make the clumps a little bit bigger, kind of give us a little bit more control, and just give us bigger shapes. It depends on what you want to go for exactly. You can change noises, cuts, copy effects. Copy effects are a very obscure setting, but there's plenty of documentation out there. But the main one you'll use is cut and noise, and this can control the shape of your clump. So I could just add this, and it makes the base of these clumps really fat. If I can do this, and that makes the tip of them really fat as well. So this is kind of your primary control. And again, create a mask, and that just allows us to reduce the effect in certain areas. I only really used it in the base of the neck and on the side of the head. So once you've got that, you can then move on to doing per hair variation. So the first one, the most simple one, is cut. What cut does is randomly changes the length of the hair based on the expression in there. You can then add C length to base it on the length of the hair, so this becomes a percentage. So you can do like cut 20% of the hairs by putting 0.2. rather than cutting 0.2 centimeters, which is the default if you don't have this C length. Increasing cut will make the hair feel a lot softer in general. It's a very helpful feature for fluffy fur. I set this very, very high. Something like 0.8 can help quite a lot for fluffy fur. There's a million ways to do it though. It's one of the nice things of grooming. There's a million ways to do everything. Once we've got that in place, I'm just going to hide my guides. We can start adding noises. So I've got 3 noises here. I normally only use 2, but 3, I'll walk through what they're doing. We had our first noise, and that will just dry things out. So it's not doing a huge amount of work. I had mine set pretty clumpy. Depending on your reference, you may want this to be way stronger, or you may want the clumps to be less defined. It's up to you. I just generally like to make my clumps very strong. It's just kind of my artistic style with Groom. But you have all the controls in the world. You can do it in your clumping, do it in your noise. It's up to you. But we add that, and that just helps dry the hair out. Again, turning that off, it's visibly the same, like we're not losing our clumps, and that's an important note with noises. You don't want to destroy your clumps out. We can still see all of them. It just dries the hair slightly, makes it less greasy, and that's a very important feature. And because we've got this C length in there, the hairs that are longer get a little bit more, and the hairs that are shorter get a little bit less noise, which ultimately makes it look the same in kind of an odd way. It makes it look more uniform. Once we've got our hair like this, we can start adding strays. So we can go into noise, and this is just a standard strays using the expression that you guys have been given. And then that just kind of goes through and pulls all the hairs out. So we've got a nice big ramp that kind of pulls the middle of the hair out quite a lot and the tip all the way. And then for this specific room, we've added another noise, and this noise is also a strays, but this one only affects the tips. So if we change that seed and make this visible, we now get some hairs that are just going to stand up a little bit, and it's going to be very subtle. You can see one just here. It's a very subtle effect, but it adds a surprising amount to the dryness. Of course, we can crank this value as high as we want to make that really obvious. Once you got to a stage like this, you can spend some time on shading. You can spend some time, if you want to do simulation, that's something we've not covered and something we won't cover. It's a completely different field of work. But once you get to this stage, you can go back, paint maps for everything, continue to refine things, match reference, match reference, match reference. That's the most important thing, is reference is absolutely king in the process. Once you get to this stage, though, once you're happy with something and you want to render it, once you've got your clump noise and everything set up the way you want, the most secure way to render is go to primitives and output, and then go down to output settings, operation, make sure that's set to render, and then your renderer will be set to none by default. Just set this to whatever you're using. Ideally, your render engine should come with an extra plugin that enables this. So we just set that to Arnold. And down here at the bottom where it says render mode, we can just set that to batch render. And that just means that it will rely on caches that are generated. So in my case, I haven't used it because I'm not moving the character in any way. But if we were moving the character, this would have to be set to batch render. Then just go to File, Export Patches for batch render, click Export File. If it's animated, click Animated and set the frame range. Hit that, and that will export a little kind of Alembic file with your scene. That just tells XGen where it needs to go. To design a shader, we just click on the description and hold right click and go to add a new material, and then select the material you want to use. In my case, I use the AI standard hair, which is just there. And then the final kind of tip that I like to give is if you select that groom or that shader, you'll have it plugged into the surface shader. So by default, it will look like this. which if we look back at our viewport, it has the Arnold shader look, which is not overly helpful. So what you can do is just drag this surface shader into the Arnold surface shader, and then create a new material for your viewport and plug that in there. And that means that you can render with one material and preview with another, which is an incredibly helpful feature. And that will be it for this tutorial series. So I really hope you've enjoyed it, and maybe one day we'll do another one. But for now, this is kind of the end of it. So feel free to rewatch all the videos as long as you want. I've given you the asset of this guy, so you can use him. If you do post stuff to Facebook grooming groups, let me know. I'm more than happy to be tagged in posts, or if you want me to kind of have a look at stuff, find me. You can find me through my website, which I'm pretty sure will be in the product page for this. But yeah, I hope you've really enjoyed it, and it's been fun to teach, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye bye, guys.